In June 2025, a bombshell New York Times report exposed Harvard University's ties to Chinese officials under U.S. sanctions, thanks to research from a firm called Strategy Risks. Harvard co hosted a held policy event with sanctioned Chinese entities, raising major red flags about foreign influence and prompting a federal investigation. Campus Reform has long reported on foreign interference in our higher education system. Today, as a reporter for the Leadership Institute's Campus Reform, I sat down with Strategy Risk CEO Isaac Stone Fish, whose findings sparked national headlines, congressional action, and serious questions about what's really going on behind closed doors at America's top universities. Strategy Risks is a geopolitical risk firm that investigates foreign influence and compliance threats within United States institutions, especially those operating in high-risk environments like China. Their research revealed that Harvard partnered with blacklisted Chinese officials, catching the attention of federal agencies, members of Congress, and even the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, who called to open an investigation into Harvard. I started by asking Mr. Stonefish just how unprecedented Secretary Rubio's recommendation is.
It is certainly unusual that the Trump administration and Secretary Rubio is taking such a heavy hand against Harvard and other universities. While we feel conflicted about some of the measures they're taking, we do appreciate all of the deserved scrutiny on Harvard and its ties to China broadly, and more specifically, the Chinese Communist Party. More specifically than that, various entities in the party, like the ex-PCC, a sanctioned entity complicit with human rights violations in Xinjiang. This administration is far more willing to slaughter sacred cows when it comes to universities. And we've seen far more aggressive tactics from this administration than administrations previously. I don't know if there's even any good example of another administration doing this. Probably the last time was during wartime, during World War II, and questions there about foreign funding and foreign links. But the last time we were fighting a major war, the US was far more decoupled from other countries and from its adversaries. With the caveat that I'm not a lawyer and certainly not a sanctions expert, one of the major implications for Harvard is it should make them think twice about any future types of partnerships, and it might even restrict them from going into other partnerships with entities that are controversial or potentially sanctioned. What I hope, and this might be naive of me, but I hope this is teaching Harvard and teaching other universities that they really need to screen for their China risks. And it's such a simple idea, but universities have been so blind in what foreign entities they partner with. And they really need to understand, and I hope Secretary Rubio is pushing on this, and I hope the Trump administration is pushing on this, makes universities understand that these are real risks and they can deal with them, but they really should deal with them before the Trump administration gets wind of what they're doing. So the risks are partnering with problematic entities that are part of the Communist Party. Some of those are entities tied to the People's Liberation Army, which is the military in China, the United Front Work Department, which is a secretive Chinese ministry that seeks to strengthen China's friends and weaken its enemies, Ministry of State Security, and then anything touching Xinjiang, the region in northwest China where upwards of 1 million Muslims and others have been held in concentration camps. And what universities can do is they can screen the entities that they have partnerships with for ties to those entities. And this is not only good for them from an ethical perspective, it's not only good for them from a Trump administration perspective, but also helps them protect their Chinese students. And so universities will say, hey, listen, we're trying to foster a good environment for our Chinese students. If that's the case, having undercover representatives from the Chinese military does not allow you to protect your students. What those partnerships means for them is that there's more likelihood that they're going to be spied on. It's more likelihood that their Chinese friends will get harassed or that their Chinese friends will feel scared about saying certain things because there are people on campus who are reporting back to Chinese authorities about what they're doing. Or from a more diffuse administration perspective, it means that these universities aren't acting their values, and it means maybe they're being more gentle on China and the Chinese Communist Party, then they should be otherwise. So we encourage folks to ask your university partners, ask the questions point blank and see how satisfied you are with the answers. That's one way to do it. The other is to try to read up on what's been written. But really, what happened at Harvard was just the tip of the iceberg. And we at Strategy Risks would love to do a lot more of this work, love to uncover those links and give information and analysis to parents and students so that they can pick the school that allows them to live their values and have a rewarding and comfortable educational experience. I'm usually worried about the things that we're not paying attention to. And so I think in this case, I'm less worried about direct foreign funding than indirect vectors of influence. And so Chinese students is a great example. Chinese students are unfortunately having to be pawns between the United States and China, but Chinese students have contributed far more to Harvard over the last decade than that foreign funding number. But Beijing has a lot of control over Chinese student flows, and it can restrict Chinese students from going to certain universities. And so universities know that in the back of their mind, they have to be careful about certain things, because if they're too explicitly, as Beijing would call it, anti-China, that might not get foreign students, and that can be very financially detrimental. And then the other issue is there's a lot of ties between individuals in universities and businesses. In one way, this is great. You want people with practical real-world experience. I teach at NYU. A lot of people have these joint partnerships. On the other hand, sometimes you have corporations with close ties to China exerting influence on universities and having them act in a way that, at the very least, deserves more transparency. Example I like to cite, let's say you have a class at Harvard or Syracuse, and there's 2 Chinese students in the class. And the class talks about democracy. And one Chinese student says something positive about democracy. The second Chinese student, who likes what the first Chinese student says, texts his father, who's a party member, and says, hey, Wang Wei over here said something nice about democracy. Isn't this interesting? Is that student spying on the other student? So on the one hand, you can just imagine being at university and texting your father and saying, oh, I learned this really interesting thing today from my classmate. Unfortunately, though, because of the way the Communist Party controls China, that can have implications for that first Chinese student. And so it's really hard making general universal rules on what is malign foreign influence and what is not. There are some very clear cases. Someone who is a colonel in the People's Liberation Army and is pretending just to be a physics professor and doesn't disclose it to anyone. Or someone from the Ministry of State Security who gives money to Chinese students to have them spy on other Chinese students. We know that's malign. But there's so much in that large, messy middle. And so the importance is, how do we talk through this? How do we decide what is right and what is wrong? And what's good at one university might not be right for another one. I was very surprised that no one at Harvard reached out. And I was very surprised by how little Harvard itself is having any sort of public conversation about its ties to China. And so I would call on Harvard to have that debate. Universities live and die on transparency and openness and a willingness to engage academically. So what Harvard should do is debate whether or not they should partner with the XPCC, whether or not they should invite Chinese leaders' children to Harvard. Have that conversation, bring it among the students, among the faculty, and then say, hey, we thought through this and we decided that it was right for us to train the XPCC, or it was wrong for us to have Xi Jinping's daughter at Harvard. But talk about it. Talk about it and then decide. And there's this mistaken sense that there are private Chinese universities. They're not. The universities in China are overseen and in most cases arms of the Communist Party. And so if you're a professor at a Chinese university, the state is paying your money, is paying your salary. And you could say, okay, that's fine, and this is similar to West Point or National Defense University, but you have to understand that if you're engaging with Fudan University or Tsinghua University or any of these universities, you're engaging with the party. the second part, there's so much that happens behind closed doors that doesn't get reported. And so I'd love to see more reporting on that. That would be fascinating to know the unknown unknowns. What are we missing in these deliberations? In terms of what the media gets wrong, I think that's a good question. I'd like to see more understanding of what this actually means on the ground. You all do a really nice job, but there are so few publications that try to understand the concrete links between universities and foreign entities. What does that mean? What is that like on a day-to-day basis? Depending on who their parents are and how comfortable they are sharing that with them, sharing it with deans of student life, sometimes going public with the information. It's tough because it is really difficult to parse out. I mean, even I often have trouble knowing, okay, is this fine? Is this just a benign example of this? Is this something that we should dig into further? And so I think part of it is, asking questions. Part of it's using your best judgment. And part of it also is just trying to stay safe and trying to balance what's in the public good versus your own safety and versus respecting your peers. So I was a journalist for a long time, and one of the things that was most frustrating to me was when entities would say, we're going to solve this internally, because they almost never did. Sometimes they do. And sometimes when a student goes to a university and says privately, hey, there's a real problem here, can you fix it? Sometimes the university fixes it, and sometimes they don't. And sometimes the time passes and it gets worse. So usually the right way to do it is, share it with a couple peers, see what they think, tell your RA, tell a dean.
Foreign influence in the American higher education system is no longer just a theoretical concern. It's a national security issue with real consequences for students, for academia, and for the country at large. Thanks to the work of strategy risks and investigators like Isaac Stone Fish, we're beginning to understand just how deep those ties can go. But the conversation is only beginning. Campus Reform will continue to follow the money, ask the tough questions, and expose the truth about what's happening on college campuses across the country. For more coverage on this issue and others like it, visit campusreform.org.